God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. Suddenly the silence of the evening was startled by a derisive shout that rose from the Piedmont host. What had happened to evoke these sounds of contempt? They had descried, between them and the sky, on the heights above them, the bending fingers of the Vaudois. On their knees, the Waldensian warriors were supplicating the god of battles. Hardly had the scoffs with which the Piedmont hailed the act died away, when a drum was heard to beat in a side valley. A child had got hold of the instrument, and was amusing himself with it. The soldiers of La Trinita saw in imagination a fresh body of Waldensians advancing from this lateral defile to rush upon them. They seized their arms in no little disorder. The Vaudois, seeing the movement of the foe, seized theirs also, and rushed downhill to anticipate the attack. The Piedmont threw away their arms and fled, chased by the Waldenses, thus losing, in half an hour, the ground it had cost them a day's fighting to gain. The weapons abandoned by the fugitives formed a much-needed and most opportune supply to the Vaudois. As the result of the combats of the day, La Trinita had 67 men slain. Of the Vaudois, 3 only had fallen. Opening on the left of La Trinita was the cornfield, vine-clad and mountain-ramparted valley of Lucerna, with its towns, La Torre, Valaro, Bobbio, and others, forming the noblest of the Waldensian valleys. La Trinita now occupied this valley with its soldiers. This was comparatively an easy achievement, almost all of its inhabitants having fled to the Pra del Tor. Those that remained were mostly Romanists, who were at that time mixed with the Waldensian population, and even they, committing their wives and daughters to the keeping of their Vaudois neighbors, had sent them with them to the Pra del Tor to escape the brutal outrages of the papal army. On the following days, La Trinita found some small affairs with the Vaudois, in all of which he was repulsed with considerable slaughter. The arduous nature of the task now in hand began to draw upon him. The mountaineers, he saw, were courageous and determined to die rather than submit their conscience to the Pope, and their families to the passions of his soldiers. He discovered, moreover, that they were a simple and confiding people, utterly unversed in the ways of intrigue. He was delightful to find these qualities in them, because he thought he saw how he could turn them to account. He had tools with him, as cunning and vile as himself. Jacques Comel, the inquisitor, and Gustave, his secretary, the latter feigned a love for the gospel. These men he set to work. When they had prepared matters, he assembled the leading men of the Waldenses, and recited to them some flattering words, which he had heard or professed to have heard the Duke and Duchess make use of towards them. He protested that this was no pleasant business in which he was engaged, and that he would be glad to have it off his hands. Peace, he thought, could easily be arranged, if they would only make a few small concessions to show that they were reasonable men. He would propose that they should deposit their arms in the house of one of their syndics, and permit him, for form's sake, to go with a small train and celebrate Mass in the church of St. Lorenzo in Angrogna, and afterwards pay a visit to the Pra del Tor. La Trinita's proposal proved the correctness of the estimate he had formed of the Vaudois confidence. The people spent a whole night in deliberation over the Count's proposition, and, contrary to the opinion of their pastors and some of their laymen, agreed to accept of it. The papal general said his Mass in the Protestant church. After this he traversed the gloomy defiles that lead up to the famous Pra. on whose green slopes, with their snowy battlements, he was so desirous to feast his eyes, though it is said he showed evident trepidation when he passed the black pool of Tempe, with its memories of retribution. Having accomplished these feats in safety, he returned to wear the mask a little longer. He resumed the efforts on which he professed to be so earnestly and laudably bent, of effecting peace. The Duke had now come nearer, and was living at Vercelli, on the plain of Piedmont. La Trinita thought that the Vaudois ought by all means to send deputies there. It would strengthen their supplication, indeed, all but ensure its success, if they would raise a sum of 20,000 crowns. On payment of the sum, he would withdraw his army and leave them to practice their religion in peace. The Vaudois, unable to conceive of dissimulation like La Trinita's, made concession after concession. They had previously laid down their arms. They now sent deputies to the Duke. Next, they taxed themselves to buy off his soldiers. And last and worst of all, at the demand of La Trinita, they sent away their pastors. It was dreadful to think of a journey across the Col Julien at that season, yet it had to be done, over its snowy summits, where the winter drifts were continually obliterating the track and piling up fresh wreaths, across the valleys of Preli and San Martino, and over the ice-clad mountains beyond, had this sorrowful band of pastors to pursue their way to find refuge among the Protestants in the French valley of Pregolus. This difficult and dangerous route was forced upon them, the more direct road through the valley of Perosa being closed by the marauders and assassins that infested it, and especially by those in the pay of the monks of Pinerolo. The Count believed that the poor people were now entirely in his power. His soldiers did their pleasure in the valley of Lucerna. They pillaged the houses abandoned by the Vaudois. The few inhabitants who had remained, as well as those who had returned, thinking that during the negotiations for peace hostilities would be suspended, were fain to make their escape a second time, and to seek refuge in the woods and caves of the higher reaches of the valleys. The outrages committed by the ruffians, to whom the valley of Lucerna was now given over, were of a kind that cannot be told. The historian Gillis has recorded a touching instance. A helpless man, who had lived 103 years, was placed in a cave, and his granddaughter, a girl of 17, was left to take care of him. The soldiers found out his hiding place. The old man was murdered, and outrage was offered to his granddaughter. She fled from the brutal pursuit of the soldiers, leaped over a precipice, and died. In another instance, an old man was pursued to the brink of a precipice by one of La Trinita's soldiers. The Vaudois had no alternative but to throw himself over the brink or die by the sword of his pursuer. He stopped, turned around, and dropped on his knees, as if to supplicate for his life. The trooper was raising his sword to strike him dead, when the Vaudois, collapsing him tightly around the legs, and swaying himself backwards with all his might, rolled over the precipice, dragging the soldier with him into the abyss. Part of the sum agreed on between La Trinita and the Waldenses had now been paid to him. To raise this money, the poor people were under the necessity of selling their herds. The Count now withdrew his army into winter quarters at Cavour, a point so near the valleys that a few hours' march would enable him to re-enter them at any moment. The corn, oil, and wine which he had not been able to carry away, he destroyed. Even the mills he broke in pieces. His design appeared to be to leave the Vaudois only the alternative of submission or dying of hunger on their mountains. To afflict them yet more, he placed garrisons here and there in the valleys, and, in the very wantonness of tyranny, required those who themselves were without bread to provide food for his soldiers. These soldiers were continually prowling about in search of victims on whom to gratify their cruelty and their lust. Those who had the unspeakable misfortune of being dragged into their den had to undergo, if men, excruciating torture, if women, revolting outrage. Chapter 7. The Great Campaign of 1561. Mass or Extermination. Covenant in the Valleys. Their solemn oath. How the Waldenses recant. Their energetic preparations. La Trinita advances his army. Twice attempts to enter Angrogna and is repulsed. A third attempt. Attacks on 3 points. Repulsed on all 3. Ravages the valley of Rora. Receives reinforcements from France and Spain. Commences a third campaign. 6 men against an army. Utter discomfiture. Extinction of La Trinita's host. Peace. These frightful inflictions the Waldenses submitted to in the hope that the deputies whom they had sent to the Duke would bring back with them an honorable peace. The impatience with which they waited their return may well be conceived. At last, after an absence of 6 weeks, the commissioners reappeared in the valleys, but their dejected faces, even before they had uttered a word, told that they had not succeeded. They had been sent back with an order, enjoining the Vaudois unconditional submission to the Church of Rome on pain of extermination. To enforce that order to the uttermost, a more numerous army was at that moment being raised. The mass or universal slaughter, such was the alternative now presented to them. The spirit of the people woke up. Rather than thus disgrace their ancestors, imperil their own souls, and entail a heritage of slavery on their children, they would die 1,000 times. Their depression was gone. They were as men who had been awakened from a heavy sleep. They had found their arms. Their first care was to recall their pastors, their next to raise up their fallen churches, their third to resume public service in them. Daily their courage grew, and once more joy lighted up their faces. There came letters of sympathy and promises of help from their fellow Protestants of Geneva, Dauphine, and France. Over the 2 latter countries persecution at that hour impended, but their own dangers made them all the more ready to help their brethren of the valleys. Thereupon, says an historian, took place one of those grand and solemn scenes which, at once heroic and religious, seem rather adapted for an epic poem than for a grave history. The Waldenses of Lucerna sent deputies across the mountains, then covered to a great depth with snow, to propose an alliance with the Protestants of the valley of Pregolus, who were at that time threatened by their sovereign Francis I. The proposed alliance was joyfully accepted. Assembling on a plateau of snow facing the mountains of Sestiers and the chain of the Genevert, the deputies swore to stand by each other and render mutual support in the coming struggle. It was agreed that this oath of alliance should be sworn with a like solemnity in the Waldensian valleys. The deputies from Pregolus, crossing the Mount Julian, arrived at Bobbio on January 21st, 1561. Their coming was singularly opportune. On the evening before, a ducal proclamation had been published in the valleys, commanding the Vaudois, within 24 hours, to give attendance at Mass, or abide the consequences. Fire, sword, the cord, the 3 arguments of Romanism, says Moustan. This was the first news with which the Pregolus deputies were met on their arrival. With all the more enthusiasm they proceeded to renew their oath. Ascending a low hill behind Bobbio, the deputies from Pregolus and those from Lucerna, standing erect in the midst of the assembled heads of families who kneeled around, pronounced these words: "In the name of the Vaudois churches of the Alps, of Dauphine and of Piedmont, which have ever been united, and of which we are the representatives, we here promise our hands on our Bible and in the presence of God, that all our valleys shall courageously sustain each other in matters of religion, without prejudice to the obedience due to their legitimate superiors. We promise to maintain the Bible, whole and without admixture, according to the usage of the true apostolic church, preserving in this holy religion, though it be at the peril of our lives, in order that we may transmit it to our children, intact and pure, as we received it from our fathers. We promise aid and help to our persecuted brothers, not regarding our individual interests, but the common cause, and not relying upon man, but upon God. The physical grandeurs of the spot were in meet accordance with the moral sublimity of the transaction. Immediately beneath was spread out the green bosom of the valley, with here and there the silver of the Pelus gleaming out amid vineyards and acacia groves. Filling the horizon on all sides, save one, stood up an array of magnificent mountains, white with the snows of winter. Conspicuous among them were the grand peaks of the Col del Malur and the Col de la Croix. They looked the silent and majestic witnesses of the oath in which the heroic people bound themselves to die, rather than permit the defilement of their hearths and the profaning of their altars by the hordes of an idolatrous tyranny. It was in this grand fashion that the Waldenses opened one of the most brilliant campaigns ever waged by their arms. The next morning, according to the Duke's order, they must choose between the Mass and the penalty annexed to refusal. The neighboring church, one of those which had been taken from them, stood ready, with altar decked with tapers lighted, for the Vaudois to hear their first Mass. Hardly the day dawned when the expected penitents were at the church door. They would show the Duke in what fashion they meant to read their recantation. They entered the building. A moment they stood surveying the strange transformation their church had undergone, and then they set at work to extinguish the tapers, pull down the images, and sweep into the street rosary and crucifix and all other paraphernalia of the popish worship. Was but the work of a few minutes. The minister, Humbert Artus, then ascended the pulpit, and reading out as his text Isaiah 45:20, "Assemble yourselves and come, draw near together, ye that are escaped of the nations. They have no knowledge that set up wood of their graven image, and pray unto a God that cannot save," preached a sermon which struck the keynote of the campaign then opening. The inhabitants of the hamlets and chalets in the mountains rushed down like their own winter torrents into the Lucerna, and the army of the Vaudois, reinforced, set out to purge the temple at Villaro. On their way they encountered the Piedmont garrison. They attacked and drove them back. The monks, signors, and magistrates who had come to receive the abjuration of the heretics, accompanying the troops in their ignominious flight. The whole band of fugitives, soldiers, priests, and judges, shut themselves up in the town of Villaro, which was now besieged by the Vaudois. Thrice did the garrison from La Tour attempt to raise the siege, and thrice they were repulsed. At last, on the 10th day, the garrison surrendered, and had their lives spared, 2 Waldensian pastors accompanying them to La Tour, the soldiers expressing greater confidence in them than in any other escort. The Count La Trinita, seeing his garrison driven out, struck his encampment at Cavour, and moved his army into the valleys. He again essayed to sow dissension among the Vaudois by entangling them in negotiations for peace. But by this time they had learned too well the value of his promises to pay the least attention to them, or to intermit for an hour their preparations for defense. It was now the beginning of February, 1561. The Vaudois labored with the zeal of men who feel that their cause is great and a righteous one, and are prepared to sacrifice all for it. They erected barricades, they planted ambushes, the appointed signals, to telegraph the movements of the enemy from post to post. Every house, says Mouston, became a manufactory of pikes, bullets, and other weapons. They selected the best marksmen their valleys could furnish, and formed them into the Flying Company, whose duty it was to hasten to the point where the danger pressed the most. To each body of fighting men they attached 2 pastors to maintain the morale of their army. The pastors, morning and evening, led the public devotions. They prayed with the soldiers before going into battle, and when fighting was over and the Vaudois were chasing the enemy down their great mountains and through their dark gorges, they exerted themselves to prevent the victory being stained by any unnecessary blood. La Trinita knew well that if he would subjugate the valleys and bring the campaign to a successful end, he must make himself master of the Pra del Tor. Into that vast natural citadel was now gathered the main body of the Waldensian people. What of their herds and provisions remained to them had been transported there also, where they had constructed mills and baking ovens. There, too, sat their council, and thence directed the whole operations of defense. A blow struck there would crush the Vaudois' heart, and convert what the Waldenses regarded as their impregnable castle into their tomb. Deferring the chastisement of the other valleys meanwhile, La Trinita directed all his efforts against Angrogna. His first attempt to enter it with his army was made on February 4. The fighting lasted till night and ended in his repulse. His second attempt, 3 days after, carried him some considerable way into Angrogna, burning and ravaging, but his partial success cost him dear, and the ground won had ultimately to be abandoned. The 14th of February saw the severest struggle. Employing all his strategy to make himself master of the much coveted Pra, with all in it, he divided his army into 3 corps, and advanced against it from 3 points. One body of troops marching along the gorges of the Angrogna, and traversing the narrow chasm that leads up to the Pra, attacked it on the south. Another body, climbing the heights from Pra Mole, and crossing the snowy flanks of the Lavachera, tried to force an entrance on the east, while a third, ascending from San Martino and crossing the lofty summits that wall in the Pra on the north, descended upon it from that quarter. The Count's confident expectation was that if the men should be unable to force an entrance at one point, they were sure to do so at another. No scout had given warning of what was approaching. While 3 armies were marching to attack them, the Waldenses, in their grand valley with its rampart of ice-crowned peaks, were engaged in their morning devotions. Suddenly, the cries of fugitives and the shouts of assailants issuing from the narrow chasm on the south broke upon their ear, together with the smoke of burning hamlets. Of the 3 points of attack, this was the easiest to be defended. 6 brave Waldensian youths strode down the valley to stop the way against La Trinita's soldiers. They were 6 against an army. The road by which the soldiers were advancing is long and gloomy, and overhung by great rocks, and so narrow that only 2 men can march abreast. On this side rises the mountain. On that, far down, thunders the torrent, a ledge in the steep face of the cliff. Running here in the darkness, there in the sunshine, serves as a pathway. It leads to what is termed the Gate of the Pra. That gateway is formed by an angle in the mountains, which obtrudes upon the narrow ledge on the one side, while a huge rock rises on the other, and still further narrows the point of ingress to the Pra del Tor. Access to the famous Pra, of which La Trinita was now striving to make himself master, there is not on this side, save through this narrow opening, seeing that on the right rises the mountain, and on the left yawns the gulf, into which, if one steps aside but in the least, he tumbles headlong. To friend and foe alike, the only entrance into the Pra del Tor in the south is by this gate of nature's own erecting. It was here that the 6 Waldensian warriors took their stand. Immovable as their own Alps, they not only checked the advance of the host, but drove it back in a panic-stricken mass, which made the precipice of the defile doubly fatal. Others would have hastened to their aid had not the danger suddenly presented itself in another quarter. On the heights of La Vechera, crossing the snow, was descried an armed troop, making their entrance into the valley on the east. Before they had time to descend, they were met by the Waldenses, who dispersed them and made them flee. 2 of the attacking parties of the Count had failed. Will the third have better success? As the Waldenses were pursuing the routed army on the La Vechera, they saw yet another armed troop, which had crossed the mountains that separate the Val San Martino from the Pra del Tor on the north, descending upon them. Instantly the alarm was raised. A few men only could they dispatch to meet the invaders. These lay in ambush at the mouth of a defile through which the attacking party was making its way down into the Pra. Emerging from the defile, and looking down into the valley beneath them, they exclaimed, "Haste, haste! Angrogna is ours!" The Vaudois, starting up and crying out, "It is you that are ours!" rushed upon them sword in hand. Trusting their superior numbers, the Piedmont soldiers fought desperately. But a few minutes sufficed for the men of the valley to hurry from the point where they were now victorious to the assistance of their brethren. The invaders, seeing themselves attacked on all sides, turned and fled up the slopes they had just descended. Many were slain, nor would a man of them have recrossed the mountains but for the pastor of the flying company, who, raising his voice to the utmost pitch, entreated the pursuers to spare the lives of those who were no longer able to resist. Among the slain was Charles Truchet, who so cruelly ravaged the commune of Rio Claret a few months before. A stone from a sling laid him prostrate on the ground, and his head was cut off with his own sword. Louis de Montuel, another noted persecutor of the Vaudois, perished in the same action. Furious at his repulse, the Count La Trinita turned his arms against the almost defenseless valley of Bora. He ravaged it, burned its little town, and chasing away its population of 80 families who escaped over the snows of the mountains to Villaro, in the valley of Lucerna. That valley he next entered with his soldiers, and though it was for the moment almost depopulated, the Popish general received so warm a welcome from those peasants who remained that, after being again and again beaten, he was fain to draw off his men-at-arms and retreat to his old quarters at Cavour, there to chew the cud over his misfortunes, and hatch new stratagems and plan new attacks, which he fondly hoped would retrieve his disgrace. La Trinita spent a month in reinforcing his army, greatly weakened by the losses it had sustained. The King of France sent him 10 companies of foot, and some other choice soldiers. There came a regiment from Spain, and numerous volunteers from Piedmont, comprising many of the nobility. From 4,000, the original number of his army, it was now raised to 7,000. He thought himself strong enough to begin a third campaign. He was confident that this time he would wipe out the disgrace which had befallen him, and sweep from the earth at once and forever the great scandal of the Waldenses. He again directed all his efforts against Angrogna, the heart and bulwark of the valleys. It was Sunday, the 17th of March, 1561. The whole of the Vaudois assembled in the Pra del Tor had met on the morning of that day, soon after dawn, as was their wont, to unite in public devotion. The first rays of the rising sun were beginning to light up the white hills around them, and the last cadences of their morning psalm were dying away on the grassy slopes of the Pra, when a sudden alarm was raised. The enemy was approaching by 3 routes. On the ridges of the eastern summits appeared one body of armed men. Another was defiling up the chasm, and in a few minutes would pour itself through the gateway already described into the Pra, while a third was forcing itself over the rocks by a path intermediate between the two. Instantly, the enemy was met on all points of approach. A handful of Waldenses sufficed to thrust back along the narrow gorge the line of glittering, curious men who were filing through it. At the other 2 points, where bastions of rock and earth had been erected, the fighting was severe, and the dead lay thick. But the day at both places went against the invaders. Some of the ablest captains were among the slain. The number of the soldiers killed was so great that Count La Trinita is said to have sat down and wept when he beheld the heaps of the dead. It was a matter of astonishment at the time that the Waldenses did not pursue the invaders, for had they done so, being so much better acquainted with the mountain paths, not one of all that host would have been left alive to carry tidings of its discomfiture to the inhabitants of Piedmont. Their pastors restrained the victorious Vaudois, having laid it down as a maxim at the beginning of the campaign, that they would use with moderation and clemency whatever victories the god of battles might be pleased to give them, and that they would spill no blood unless when absolutely necessary to prevent their own being shed. The Piedmont dead was again out of all proportion to those who had fallen on the other side, so much so that it was currently said in the cities of Piedmont that God was fighting for the Barbettes. More deeply humiliated and disgraced than ever, La Trinita led back the remains of his army to his old quarters. Well had it been for him if he had never set foot within the Waldensian territory, and not less so for many of those who followed him, including not a few of the nobles of Piedmont, whose bones were now bleaching on the mountains of the Vaudois. But the popish general was slow to see the lesson of these events. Even yet he harbored the design of returning to assail that fatal valley where he had lost so many laurels and buried so many soldiers. But he covered his purpose with craft. Negotiations had opened between the men of the valleys and the Duke of Savoy, and as they were proceeding satisfactorily, the Vaudois were without suspicions of evil. This was the moment that La Trinita chose to attack them. He hastily assembled his troops, and on the night of the 16th of April, he marched them against the Pra del Tor, hoping to enter it unopposed and give the Vaudois as sheep to the slaughter. The snows around the Pra were beginning to burn in the light of morning, when the attention of the people, who had just ended their united worship, was attracted by unusual sounds which were heard to issue from the gorge that led into the valley. On the instant, 6 brave mountaineers rushed to the gateway that opens from the gorge. The long file of La Trinita's soldiers was seen advancing 2 abreast. Their helmets and cuirasses glittered in the light. The 6 Vaudois made their arrangements and calmly waited till the enemy was near. The first 2 Vaudois, holding loaded muskets, knelt down. The second 2 stood erect, ready to fire over the heads of the first 2. The third 2 undertook the loading of the weapons as they were discharged. The invaders came on. As the first 2 of the enemy turned the rock, they were shot down by the 2 foremost Vaudois. The next 2 of the attacking force fell in like manner by the shot of the Vaudois in the rear, the third rank of the enemy presenting themselves only to be laid by the side of their comrades. In a few minutes, a little heap of dead bodies blocked the pass, rendering impossible the advance of the accumulating file of the enemy in the chasm. Meanwhile, other Vaudois climbed the mountain that overhung the gorge in which the Piedmont army was imprisoned. Tearing up the great stones with which the hillside was strewn, the Vaudois sent them rolling down upon the host. Unable to advance from the wall of the dead in front, and unable to flee from the ever-accumulating masses behind, the soldiers were crushed in dozens by the falling rocks. Panic set in, and panic in such a position how dreadful! Wedged together on a narrow ledge, with a murderous rain of rocks falling on them, their struggle to escape was frightful. They jostled one another and trod each other underfoot, while vast numbers fell over the precipice and were clashed on the rocks or drowned in the torrent. Then those at the entrance of the valley, who were watching the result, saw the crystal of the Angrogna begin about midday to be changed into blood. "Ah," said they, "the Pra del Tor has been taken. La Trinita has triumphed. There flows the blood of the Vaudois." And indeed, the Count, on beginning his march that morning, is said to have boasted that by noon the torrent of the Angrogna would be seen to change color. And so in truth it did. Instead of a pellucid stream rolling along on a white gravelly bed, which is its usual appearance in the mouth of the valley, it was now deeply dyed from recent slaughter. But when the few who had escaped the catastrophe returned to tell what had passed within the defiles of the Angrogna, it was seen that it was not the blood of the Vaudois, but the blood of their ruthless invaders, which dyed the waters of the Angrogna. The Count withdrew on that same night with his army to return no more to the valleys. Negotiations were again resumed, not this time through the Count La Trinita, but through Philip of Savoy, Count of Paconis, and were speedily brought to a satisfactory issue. The Duke of Savoy had but small merit in making peace with the men whom he found he could not conquer. The capitulation was signed on the 5th of June, 1561, and its first clause granted an indemnity for all offenses. It is open to remark that this indemnity was given to those who had suffered, not to those who had committed the offenses it condoned. The articles that followed permitted the Vaudois to erect churches in their valleys, with the exception of 2 or 3 of their towns, to hold public worship, in short, to celebrate all of the offices of their religion. All the ancient franchises, immunities, and privileges, whether conceded by His Highness or by His Highness's predecessors, were renewed, provided they were vouched by public documents. Such was the arrangement that closed this war of 15 months. The Vaudois ascribed it in great part to the influence of the good Duchess Margaret. The Pope designated it a pernicious example, which he feared would not want imitators in those times when the love of many to the Roman See was waxing cold. It stank in the nostrils of the prelates and the monks of Piedmont, to whom the heretics had been a free booty. Nevertheless, Duke Emmanuel Philibert faithfully maintained its stipulations, the Duchess being by his side to counteract any pressure in the contrary direction. This peace, together with the summer that was now opening, began to slowly efface the deep scars the persecution had left on the valleys, and what further helped to console and reanimate this brave but afflicted people was a sympathy and aid universally tendered them by Protestants abroad, in particular by Calvin and the Elector Palatine, the latter addressing a spirited letter to the Duke on behalf of his persecuted subjects. Nothing was more admirable than the spirits of devotion to which the Vaudois exhibited all through these terrible conflicts. Their valleys resounded not less with the voice of prayer and praise than with the din of arms. Their opponents came from carousing, from blaspheming, from murdering, to engage in battle. The Waldenses rose from their knees to unsheath the sword, and wield in it a cause which they firmly believed to be that of him to whom they had bent in supplication. When their little army went afield, their barbs always accompanied it, to inspirit the soldiers by suitable exhortations before joining battle, and to moderate in the hour of victory a vengeance which, however excusable, would yet have lowered the glory of the triumph. When the fighting men hastened to the bastion or to the defile, the pastors betook them to the mountain slope or to its summit, and there with uplifted hands supplicated help from the Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. When the battle had ceased, and the enemy were in flight, and the victors had returned from chasing their invaders from the valleys, the gray-haired pastor, the lion-hearted man of battle, the matron, the maiden, the stripling, the little child, would assemble in the Pra del Tor, and while the setting sun was kindling into glory the mountain tops of their once more ransomed land, they would raise their voices together and sing the old war song of Judah in strains so heroic that the great rocks around them would send back the thunder of their praise in louder echoes than those of the battle whose triumphant issue they were celebrating. Chapter 8. Waldensian Colonies in Calabria and Apulia. An inn at Turin. 2 Waldensian youths. A stranger. Invitation to Calabria. The Waldenses search the land. They settle there. Their colony flourishes. Build towns. Cultivate science. They hear of the Reformation. Petition for a fixed pastor. Jean-Louis Pascal sent. Apprehended. Brought in chains to Naples. Conducted to Rome. One day, about the year 1340, 2 Waldensian youths were seated in an inn in Turin, engaged in earnest conversation respecting their home prospects. Shut up in their valleys, and cultivating with toil their somewhat sterile mountains, they sighed for wider limits and a more fertile land. "Come with me," said a stranger, who had been listening unperceived to the discourse. "Come with me, and I will give you fertile fields for your barren rocks." The person who now courteously addressed the youths, and whose steps Providence had directed to the same hotel with themselves, was a gentleman from Calabria, at the southern extremity of the Italian peninsula. On their return to the valleys, the youths reported the words of the stranger, and the flattering hopes he had held out should they be willing to migrate to this southern land, where skies more genial and an earth more tillable would reward their labors with more bounteous harvests. The elders of the Vaudois people listened, not without interest. The population of their valleys had recently received a great accession in the Albigensian refugees, who had escaped from the massacre of Innocent III in the south of France, and the Waldenses, feeling themselves overcrowded, were prepared to welcome any fair scheme that promised an enlargement of their boundaries. But before acceding to the proposition of the stranger, they thought it advisable to send competent persons to examine this new and to them unknown land. The Vaudois explorers returned with a flattering account of the conditions and capabilities of the country they had been invited to occupy. Compared with their own more northern mountains, whose summits winter covers all the year with snow, whose gorges are apt to be swept by furious gusts, and their sides stripped of their corn and vines by devastating torrents, Calabria was a land of promise. "There are beautiful hills," says the historian Gillis, describing the settlement, "clothed with all kinds of fruit trees, spontaneously springing up, according to their situation, in the plains, vines and chestnuts, on the rising ground, walnuts and every fruit tree. Everywhere were seen rich, arable land and few laborers. A considerable body of immigrants set out for this new country. The young men were accompanied to their future homes with partners. They carried with them the Bible, that holy ark of the new covenant, and of everlasting peace. The conditions of their immigration offered a reasonable security for the free and undisturbed exercise of their worship. By a convention of the local seigneurs, ratified later by the King of Naples, Ferdinand of Aragon, They were permitted to govern their own affairs, civil and spiritual, by their own magistrates and their own pastors. The first settlement was near the town of Montalto. Half a century later rose the city of San Sexto, which afterwards became the capital of the colony. Other towns and villages sprang up, and the region, which before had been thinly inhabited and poorly cultivated, was soon transformed into a smiling garden. The swelling hills were clothed with fruit trees, the plains waved with luxuriant crops. So struck was the Marquis of Spinello with the prosperity and wealth of the settlements that he offered to cede land of his own vast and fertile estates where these colonists might build cities and plant vineyards. One of their towns he authorized them to surround with a wall, hence its name, LaGuardia. This town, situated on a height near the sea, soon became populous and opulent. Toward the close of the same century, another body of Vaudois emigrants from Provence arrived in the south of Italy. The newcomers settled in Apulia, not far from their Calabrian brethren. Villages and towns arose, and the region speedily put on a new face under the improved arts and husbandry of the colonists. Their smiling homes, which looked forth from amid groves of orange and myrtle, their hills covered with the olive and the vine, their cornfields and pasture lands, were the marvel and the envy of their neighbors. In Calabria, yet another emigration arrived from the valleys of Pergolus and Frosiniers, 1500 A.D. This third body of colonists established themselves on the Volturata, a river which flows from the Apennines into the Bay of Torrento. With the increase of their numbers came an increase of prosperity to the colonists. Their neighbors, who knew not the secret of this prosperity, were lost in wonder and admiration of it. The physical attributes of the region occupied by the immigrants differed in no respect from those of their own lands. Both were placed under the same sky, but how different the aspect of the one from that of the other. The soil, touched by the plough of Vaudois, seemed to feel a charm that made it open its bosom and yield a tenfold increase. The vine tended by the Vaudois hands bore rich clusters, and strove in generous rivalry with the fig and olive to outdo them in enriching with its produce the Vaudois board. And how delightful the quiet and order of their towns, and the air of happiness on the faces of the people, and how sweet to listen to the bleating of the flocks on the hills, the lowing of the herds in the meadows, the song of the reaper and grape-gatherer, and the merry voices of children at play around the hamlets and villages. For about 200 years these colonies continued to flourish. It is a curious circumstance, says the historian Macri, that the first gleam of light, at the revival of letters, shone on that remote spot of Italy where the Vaudois had found an asylum. Petrarch first acquired a knowledge of the Greek tongue from Barlaam, a monk of Calabria, and Boccaccio was taught it from Leontius Pilatus, who was a student of Barlaam, if not also a native of the same place. Mouston says that the sciences flourished among them. The day of the Renaissance had not yet broken. The flight of scholars, which was to bear with its seeds of ancient learning to the west, had not yet taken place, but the Vaudois of Calabria would seem to have anticipated that great literary revival. They had brought with them the scriptures in the Romance version. They possessed doubtless the taste and genius of which the Romance nations were then famous, and moreover in their southern settlement they may have had access to some knowledge of those sciences which the Saracens then so assiduously cultivated. And what so likely with their leisure and wealth as that these Vaudois should then turn their attention to letters as well as to husbandry, and make their adopted country vocal with the strains of that minstrelsy with which Provence and Dauphine had resounded so melodiously, till its music was quenched at once and forever by the murderous arms of Simon de Montfort. But here we can only doubtfully guess, for the records of this interesting people are scanty and dubious. These colonists kept up their connection with the mother country of their valleys, though situated at the opposite extremity of Italy, to keep alive their faith, which was the connecting link. Pastors were sent in relays of 2 to minister to the churches of Calabria and Apulia, and when they had fulfilled their term of 2 years, they were replaced by other 2. The Barbs, on their way back to the valleys, visited their brethren in the Italian towns, for at that time there were few cities in the peninsula in which the Vaudois were not to be found. The grandfather of the Vaudois historian, Gillis, in the one of these pastoral visits to Venice, was assured by the Waldenses, whom he there conversed with, that there were not fewer than 6,000 of their nation in that city. Fear had not yet awakened the suspicion and kindled the hatred of the Romanists, for the Reformation was not yet come, nor did the Waldenses care to thrust their opinions upon the notice of their neighbors. Still the priests could not help observing that the manners of these northern settlers were in many things peculiar and strange. They eschewed revels and feasts. They had their children taught by foreign schoolmasters. In their churches was neither image nor lighted taper. They never went on pilgrimage. They buried their dead without the aid of the priests, and never were they known to bring a candle to the Virgin's shrine or purchase a mass for the help of their dead relative. These peculiarities were certainly startling, but one thing went far to atone for them. They paid with the utmost punctuality and fidelity their stipulated tithes, and as the value of their lands was yearly increasing, there was a corresponding yearly increase in both the tithe due to the priests and the rent payable to the landlord, and neither was anxious to disturb a state of things so beneficial to himself, and which was every day becoming more advantageous. I wish to express a special thanks to all the supporters of First Amendment Radio and our mission on true prophecy reformation. If you would like to support the work here with a special one-time gift, it would be greatly appreciated. We, however, always prefer an ongoing faithful gift of support for the labor that continues here always. So please consider carefully how much you are able to continue without undue hardship to your own household. In the least, please like and share and subscribe wherever you are receiving this work. Thank you.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Secrets of the Rapture. Is there a 500-year-old conspiracy? A propaganda machine so pervasive and entrenched, yet so elusive that the entire world could be taken in by it, working in plain sight, but unseen by the world for what it truly is? If prophecy is God-given history in advance, why does the prophecy that has conquered the age also exclude nearly 2,000 years of history? What is it that they are afraid that the light of history will reveal? To understand our place in time and prophecy, we must look in history for an interpretation, that which stands the test of time, that which agrees with the Word of God, and history has proven to be true. When cunning fables and fearful speculations are removed from our sight, then we may clearly see what is truly expressed in Bible prophecy, both that which has been fulfilled and that which has yet to come. God's express word is the sword that must be wielded to remove the scales from the eyes and dispel the darkness of deceitful conjecture. Secrets of the Rapture was written to expose that which the spirit of the age has conjured out of the darkness to blind the eyes of the church in the world today. Secrets of the Rapture, Deconstructing Pre-Tribulation Dispensational Futurism by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur, is now available at Amazon. Secrets of the Rapture,